Greetings everyone. As you know, we're all for the rest of the semester switched over to online learning, and that includes this course on the philosophy of socialism. I'm planning to keep things fairly simple. In Canvas, I'm creating a separate module for each week of the course, which means 7 modules in all. This is a work in progress. Right now, I've put content into the first 3 modules, so there's plenty for you to be going on with. In the first module, there's a brief overview of socialism as it's generally understood today, a reading and a lecture related to the Putney debates in 17th century England, and an excerpt from a famous essay by the French philosopher Jean-Jacques Rousseau on the origin of inequality. Let me say a few words about the first of these texts. When I was first planning this course, as some of you know, I intended to combine it with a 2-week study abroad trip to the UK at the end of the semester. Sadly, that isn't going to happen. But that's why in the first part of the course I've included material to give us some grasp of the history of socialism. And there is definitely a slight orientation towards Britain, since I was looking for material that would relate to places I planned for students to visit. Britain is obviously very important to the history of socialism for various reasons. First of all, the English Revolution of the mid-17th century saw not only the beginning of modern democratic thinking, but also the first bold expression of the idea that people should enjoy equal rights regardless of birth or wealth. The Industrial Revolution began in Britain in the mid to late 1700s with the development of cotton and wool industries in the north. The early mills were powered by water, but after the invention of the steam engine, industrial factories grew much bigger and more productive. The range of things produced also increased rapidly. In the 19th century, Britain, along with France, was one of the places where socialist ideas grew up and took hold. Karl Marx, the foremost socialist theoretician, spent the second half of his life there, from 1850 to 1883. His great work, Capital, is largely based on his analysis of capitalism as it developed in Britain during the first half of the 19th century. So that's why in the first few weeks I'm including some historical background. But it's not just history. Understanding where ideas come from, how and why they arose, and how they've changed over time, is part of achieving a full understanding of the ideas themselves. When it comes to socialism, one of the questions we'll obviously be asking is whether it is an outlook that remains relevant today, or whether, as its critics argue, it is a philosophy that has either been refuted by history, or at best has passed its sell-by date. The text and the podcast on the Putney debates don't require much commentary. Really, the most important item here is the emergence of certain radical ideas. The struggle between King Charles and Parliament, led by Oliver Cromwell, was all about the distribution of power. Charles thought he should have absolute power. Parliament thought that power should be shared with them. The eventual upshot was that in Britain, Parliament became more powerful than the monarch. And since Parliament consisted of elected representatives, that meant that power was being dispersed to the people who elected them. An obvious question arises. Who should have the vote? Cromwell's army was a hotbed of radical ideas. One group was called the Levellers. They argued that every man, or at least most men, should have the vote. The idea that women ought to have the vote was still a long way off. A more radical group called themselves the True Levellers, and they were also called the Diggers. They were Protestants who were inspired by the biblical account of how Jesus' apostles shared everything in common. The Diggers argued for much greater economic equality, and they also thought that people should enjoy a closer, healthier relationship to nature by growing their own food. They tried to put these ideas into practice by planting crops on a plot of common ground, but local landowners sent in thugs to attack them. They were also prosecuted and forced off the land by the courts. Political equality, economic equality, the idea of sharing things in common rather than insisting that everything be private property, respect for ordinary people and ordinary work such as growing food, advancing the claims of the poor and criticising the privileges of the rich. These are all ideas that eventually feed into and inspire socialist thinking.